In this video, we're going over how to turn a still photograph into a 3D scene with parallax using Photoshop and After Effects. Make sure to join our Patreon to get a ton of perks, including a private VFX Masterminds chat where you can talk to other VFX artists. Link in the description below. So first we need to break up our photograph into isolated layers using Photoshop. Let's duplicate the original layer and title it Subject and then hide the original. Then in the Select menu, we'll choose Subject. Photoshop is smart enough to detect that we have a human in the scene and creates an almost perfect selection around the subject. To make sure it's an absolutely perfect selection, we'll grab the Quick Selection tool and zoom in to refine things down even more, holding the Shift key and dragging to add to our selection, and holding the Alt key and dragging to remove any unwanted areas. For this, I'm using a tablet, which I highly recommend as it makes things much easier and faster when you can use a stylus versus using a mouse. Once the selection is good, we'll click the Add Layer Mask button to create a mask, then hide the subject layer for now. Selecting the original layer again, let's duplicate it again, and this time we'll title it Ground. Next, we'll select the layer mask from the subject layer, and while holding the Alt key, we'll drag it onto the ground layer. Then with the copied mask selected, we'll hit Ctrl+I to invert the mask. Then using the pen tool, we'll mask out the background and ceiling from this layer. Once that's done, we'll hit the Selection button, add some slight feathering, and delete the selected area. After that, we'll duplicate the ground layer, then right-click on the mask and choose Apply Layer Mask to the duplicated layer, and then hide the original ground layer. The duplication is just in case we make a mistake, and we can go back to our original mask if we have to. Using the Rectangle Marquee tool, we'll make selections around the empty space and use Content-Aware Fill to roughly fill in the gaps. Then we'll use the Clone Stamp tool to clean up areas that Content-Aware Fill wasn't able to accurately replicate. The reason we're doing this is because we need an isolated ground layer without the subject in it because of the parallax movement we'll get once we start animating the camera in After Effects. So a clean ground plate is necessary even if the movement is subtle. Next, let's hide the ground layer and duplicate the original one more time, this time calling it Ceiling. Using the pen tool again, we'll draw a mask around the ceiling, then we'll export each layer separately as PNGs to bring into After Effects. Once we're in After Effects, we'll create a new comp and drag in all the isolated layers, including our video clip of these black holes colliding as our new background, to make this a cool kind of sci-fi type scene. Let's set all the layers to be 3D layers, and then we'll create a camera, setting the focal length to 50mm with depth of field enabled. Then we'll enable 2 view mode and set one of the sides to top-down view to get a better sense of space. Once that's done, we'll push the black hole background layer really far back along the Z-axis and then scale it up and reposition to fill the frame. Then we'll push the ceiling layer back on the Z-axis just a little bit past the ground layer and pull the subject layer a little closer to the camera to create some depth separation between the foreground layers. Now with the camera selected, we'll move the playhead to around 6 seconds and add keyframes for point of interest and position, and we'll set the focus distance to 10,000. Then we'll set the iris shape to octagon and push the blur level up to give us some nice depth of field. Now moving the playhead to the first frame, we'll zoom the camera in along the Z-axis and then adjust the X-axis over a bit as well as the Y-axis of point of interest to change the angle of view. Then selecting all of the last keyframes, we'll hit F9 on the keyboard to add easy ease so that the camera doesn't come to an unnatural stop. And now that our animation is set, we just need to composite the foreground and background together so that they become one unified scene. So we'll select all of the foreground layers and pre-comp them together, and then do the same with the black hole background layer. Next, let's copy the camera layer and paste it into each of the new pre-comps and then disable the camera in the main comp. We're doing this so that each pre-comp has a matching camera because the compositor we're going to use doesn't recognize the camera layer unless it's part of a pre-comp. So as long as both pre-comps have the same camera with the same animation embedded in them, everything will work. Now once that's done, we'll select both pre-comps, right-click, and add them to Red Giant Supercomp plugin. Then we'll open up the Supercomp panel, and with our foreground layer selected, we'll add some color correction to match the foreground with the background, a small amount of edge blending, a healthy amount of light wrap since this is a huge powerful light source, setting both the amount and size to 100%, the mode to add, and method to encroachment. And then top it off with some diffusion with the amount set to 50% and size set to 30 to add a little bit of soft glowiness. Then we'll select the background pre-comp and add a Red Giant Optical Glow effect to add some glow to the black hole rings, setting the amount to 3, the size to 200, and the highlight roll-off to 50. Then finally, we'll add some color grading and render out the animation.